1992, Stanford University. A young neuroscientist publishes a paper on testosterone and aggression in olive baboons. The paper is careful, methodical, and largely unremarkable by the standards of primatology. It will not change the field. But the man who wrote it will spend the next 30 years quietly assembling what may be the most unsettling argument in the history of behavioral science. Not about baboons, about you. His name is Robert Sapolsky, and his argument is this: you have never made a free choice in your life. Not once. Not ever. This is not a rhetorical provocation. It is not a thought experiment. It is a biological, neurological, endocrinological, and evolutionary claim, assembled piece by piece across 6 decades of science, and by the time Sapolsky finishes laying it out, the weight of it is difficult to carry. Because if he is right, then the most fundamental story we tell about ourselves, that we are agents, that we choose, that we could have done otherwise, is a story we invented. An extremely convincing story, but a story nonetheless. The question this video will sit with is not whether determinism is philosophically defensible. That argument is centuries old. The question is what it means, what it actually means, concretely, viscerally, if the science is right. What happens to guilt? What happens to punishment? What happens to praise, to pride, to the feeling of having earned something? What happens to the self? What happens to you? Robert Sapolsky was born in Brooklyn in 1957. He grew up fascinated by primates, not metaphorically, not as a passing interest, but obsessively. By adolescence, he was writing letters to the American Museum of Natural History, teaching himself Swahili, memorizing the taxonomy of African megafauna. He was, by his own admission, an unusual child. He went to Harvard, studied biological anthropology, then to Rockefeller University for graduate work in neuroendocrinology. In 1978, still a graduate student, he traveled to Kenya for the first time. He would return every year for decades. He spent summers living among a troop of olive baboons in the Masai Mara, earning their trust slowly, or rather, earning their indifference, which, in baboon social terms, amounts to the same thing. He injected anesthetized baboons with hormonal assays, tracked their cortisol levels through stress and recovery, mapped the relationship between social hierarchy, aggression, and glucocorticoid damage. The baboons taught him something that the library could not. That behavior is not mysterious. That aggression, submission, love, anxiety, social striving, these are not expressions of inner spirit. They are outputs. They are what the biology produces when it runs. Sapolsky's intellectual project spans 5 major books, hundreds of papers, and a course on human behavioral biology at Stanford that became one of the most watched lecture series online before anyone had a name for what that meant. But it was not until 2023, with the publication of Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will, that he finally stated the conclusion explicitly, without qualification, without the careful academic hedging that scholars usually use to protect their reputation from the thing they actually believe. Free will does not exist. Let us understand exactly what this claim is. It is not the claim that humans are robots, that we are simple, predictable, mechanistic. Sapolsky is among the world's foremost appreciators of biological complexity. His previous book, Behave, runs to nearly 800 pages and is essentially a love letter to how intricate human behavior is. The argument is not that we are simple. The argument is that complexity does not equal freedom. Here is the structure of the argument, laid out in its bones. Every behavior you exhibit, every word you choose, every impulse you restrain or follow, every judgment you form about another person, emerges from the state of your nervous system in the moment just before. That is the proximate cause. But that nervous system state did not appear from nowhere. It was shaped by the hormonal environment of your body in the hours and days before. That environment was shaped by your sleep, your nutrition, your levels of chronic stress, the social dynamics of your workplace, the quality of your last conversation. Those were shaped by your developmental history, by the trauma or security of your childhood, by the epigenetic marks laid down in adolescence, by the environmental stressors that modified gene expression before you were conscious of having a self at all. That developmental history was shaped by the genes you were born with. Those genes were the product of your ancestry, of evolutionary pressures extending back not thousands but millions of years. And those evolutionary pressures were shaped by the ecological context, the climate, the available resources, the presence of predators, factors that extend back further than the human species, into the deep history of life itself. At every step in that chain, from the flash of neurons in the second before action, back through evolutionary deep time, there is no point at which you inserted yourself. There is no moment at which something outside the causal chain reached in and made a choice. The chain is closed. It runs all the way down. This is the argument. It is not complicated in its structure. It is devastating in its implications. But Sapolsky is not content to rest on the philosophical argument alone. Determined is not a philosophy book. It is a science book. And the science it marshals is specific, empirical, and in several places, almost unbearably concrete. Consider the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain most associated with what we call willpower, self-control, deliberate choice. When you resist an impulse, when you decide not to say the cruel thing, when you choose the long-term reward over the short-term one, the prefrontal cortex is doing heavy lifting. We tend to think of this as the seat of agency, the part of us that overrides the animal and acts from principle. But the prefrontal cortex does not finish developing until the mid-20s. In adolescence, it is structurally incomplete. An adolescent who makes impulsive, destructive decisions is not demonstrating a failure of will. They are demonstrating an organ that has not finished being built. We do not blame a person for failing to see with an eye that has not finished forming, but we routinely punish adolescents for failing to exercise a brain that is not structurally capable of exercising it. And the prefrontal cortex, once developed, is not stable. Chronic stress degrades it. Sleep deprivation degrades it. Hunger degrades it. A phenomenon so well documented that the study of Israeli parole boards became a landmark in behavioral economics. Judges who heard cases just before lunch were significantly more likely to deny parole than judges who had recently eaten. The hungry judge is a worse judge. Not because they choose to be, because they are. Go deeper. Consider the glucocorticoids, the stress hormones, cortisol chief among them. Chronic exposure to elevated glucocorticoids during childhood does measurable structural damage to the hippocampus, the brain region, responsible for forming new memories and regulating the stress response. A child raised in poverty, in an environment of chronic unpredictability, noise, threat, insecurity, will have a hippocampus shaped differently than a child raised in stability. Not metaphorically, physically. The cells are different, the volume is different, the connectivity is different. That altered hippocampus will shape how the adult responds to stress, with more anxiety, more reactivity, more difficulty modulating fear responses. The adult who grew up in poverty is more likely to make decisions that look, from the outside, like poor impulse control or excessive risk-taking. We tend to explain this with reference to character, to values, to the choices they made. Sapolsky's argument is that we are explaining the output while ignoring the machinery. And then there is genetics. Sapolsky is careful here. Careful in the way that a scientist who has watched the history of genetic determinism be weaponized is always careful. He does not argue for genetic determinism in the simple sense. Genes do not cause behaviors, but genes constrain the range of possible nervous systems that a given individual can develop. And nervous systems constrain behavior. The MAOA gene, sometimes called the warrior gene in the popular press, a framing Sapolsky would despise, modulates serotonin metabolism. Certain variants of this gene, in combination with childhood abuse, correlate strongly with adult violence. Not in every case, not deterministically, but the correlation is real, replicable, and meaningful. The person who carries a particular variant of MAOA and was abused as a child is not choosing to be violent in the same sense as someone who was not. The causal machinery that produced the violence is different. Our moral intuitions, however, tend not to track that difference. What Sapolsky is doing across hundreds of pages is something specific. He is closing the gaps. Every argument for free will, when examined closely, turns out to rest on a gap, a space in the causal account where freedom is supposed to live. The gap between stimulus and response, but neuroscience increasingly fills that gap with mechanism. The gap between instinct and reason, but the prefrontal cortex that does the reasoning is itself a product of the same causal chain. The gap between genetics and behavior. But epigenetics shows that environment modifies gene expression in ways that are themselves determined. The gap keeps getting smaller. Sapolsky's argument is that there is no gap. There has never been a gap. There is only the causal chain, which we did not choose, which runs through us, which produces us, and which we call, with great feeling, ourselves. There is a philosopher named Daniel Dennett who spent much of his career arguing against this conclusion. Dennett, whose work on consciousness and evolution Sapolsky respected deeply, believed that free will is real, but not what you think. That when you deliberate, when you weigh options and act on reasons, something meaningful is happening that deserves to be called free choice, even if it is implemented in neurons, even if those neurons are causally connected to everything else. Dennett called this compatibilism. Sapolsky is not a compatibilist. He finds compatibilism intellectually unsatisfying in the way that a certain kind of scientific mind finds the softer consolations unsatisfying, not because he wants to be harsh, but because he thinks the consolation is purchased at the cost of honesty. To say that freedom is acting in accordance with your values when those values were themselves not chosen, when they were installed by a childhood you did not design, a culture you were born into, a nervous system you inherited, is to use the word freedom to describe the very thing freedom is supposed to escape. This does not sit easily. It is not supposed to. The question that follows from all of this is not subtle. If no one is ever truly the author of their actions, if every murderer, every abuser, every person who made your life harder than it needed to be was produced by a causal chain they never chose to enter, what do we do? This is where Sapolsky's argument becomes not just intellectually serious, but morally radical. He is not arguing for nihilism. He is not arguing that nothing matters, that harm is acceptable, that we should abandon judgment altogether. He is arguing for something more precise, that we need to disentangle two things we have collapsed together: blame and consequence. We imprison people partly for incapacitation, to prevent them from harming others. That is a consequentialist argument that does not require blame. We imprison people partly for rehabilitation, to change the causal machinery so that different behavior becomes more likely. That does not require blame either. We imprison people partly for deterrence, to send a signal that shifts the cost-benefit calculation for others. That also does not require blame. But we also imprison people. And more fundamentally, we construct our entire moral and social life around the practice of retribution. Punishment in the sense of making someone suffer, because they deserve to suffer, because they chose to do what they did, and they could have done otherwise, and they did not. This is the part that Sapolsky wants to cut away. Not the practical mechanisms of consequence, the layer of moral deserving underneath them. And here is where the argument becomes not just a challenge to criminal justice, but to something closer to home. Because the same logic that denies moral desert to the murderer denies it to you and to me in both directions. You did not earn your intelligence. You did not deserve your capacity for discipline, or your parents who read to you, or your neighborhood that did not corrode your prefrontal cortex with chronic stress. The person who seems to you to have made terrible choices, who seems to have wasted opportunities, who seems to have failed to try, that person also did not choose their starting conditions, their biology, their capacity to do otherwise. The feeling of deserving, the warmth of having earned something, is not false in the sense of being unpleasant. It is false in the deeper sense. It describes a freedom that was never there. Sapolsky is honest that this is cold, that the world he is describing, a world without ultimate desert, is one in which some of our deepest satisfactions are confiscated. The satisfaction of righteous anger, the satisfaction of credit, the satisfaction of having overcome. But he is also honest that this is the world we actually live in. And he argues, with a quiet, steady insistence, that the alternative is not warm, that the world organized around moral desert is the world that produces our extraordinary tolerance for cruelty toward people we have decided deserved it, toward prisoners, toward the poor, toward anyone whose failures can be attributed to choice rather than to circumstance. The world of moral desert is not a kind world. It merely feels kind to those who, through circumstances they did not choose, ended up on the right side of the deserving line. There is something else, something that Sapolsky does not emphasize, but that runs underneath the argument, like a low-frequency tone. If no one is responsible for who they are, if the self is a process produced by forces anterior to it, then the self is, in some meaningful sense, an illusion. Not in the eliminativist sense, necessarily. The process is real. The experience of being a self is real. But the author behind the process, the thing that could have written the story differently, that author is not there, was never there. We are the story. We are not its author. What do you do with that? Where do you put it? There is no comfortable shelf for this idea. It does not become less strange with familiarity. It becomes, if anything, stranger, because the more you look at it, the more you notice how much of ordinary life is organized around its opposite, around the assumption of authorship, around the feeling that the person you are meeting is responsible for being who they are, around the feeling that you are. In the last chapter of Determined, Sapolsky writes something that surprised his critics, who had expected a book about the absence of free will to be a grim document. He writes that the world without free will is in some ways more compassionate than the one we inhabit. That if we genuinely internalized the causal story, if we really believed it, not just intellectually but in our gut, in our moment-to-moment response to the people around us, we might find it easier to be kind. Because kindness does not require deserving. Kindness just requires being present to what is. Sapolsky spent decades watching baboons. He watched them form alliances and betray them. He watched them comfort each other after fights, groom each other for hours, protect each other's young. He watched them build social worlds of remarkable complexity without any theory of mind that extended to questions of desert or blame. They responded to behavior. They adjusted to consequences. They did not, as far as anyone can tell, experience the additional layer of moral judgment that we add on top, the layer that says, you could have been otherwise, and you chose not to be, and that is your fault. It is not clear whether losing that layer would be a loss or a relief. Sapolsky seems to think it would be a relief, not a comfortable one, not a warm one, but a true one. The relief of putting down something very heavy that you have been carrying without knowing it. The relief of looking at another person, even a person who has done terrible things, and seeing, just for a moment, the causal chain that produced them, stretching back through their childhood, their biology, their ancestry, their evolutionary history, to conditions that existed long before they did. He is in his late 60s now. He has been going to Kenya for most of his adult life. The baboon troop he studied for decades is gone. Many of them lost to tuberculosis in the late 80s. He documented their deaths. He documented what happened to the troop afterward, how the loss of the most aggressive males changed the social dynamics, how a culture of lower stress and greater tolerance propagated forward through the generations that followed. Culture. In baboons, the causal chain runs forward as well as backward. What we do now, what kind of environments we build, what kind of stress we impose or relieve, what kind of institutions we construct that shape the nervous systems of children who have not yet been born. All of that will be part of the causal chain that produces people we will never meet, making choices we will never see, carrying histories they will not fully understand. We did not choose to be here, in this strange interval of cosmic time, aware enough to ask these questions and not wise enough to answer them. But we are here, And the question is not whether we deserve to be. The question is what we do with it. That question, it turns out, is also not free. But it is ours.